Hey guys, tonight we begin with the story about a man who spent most of his life thinking in ways nobody else could quite follow. So dim the lights, make yourself comfortable, maybe grab a warm cup of tea, and let's drift into the world of Nikola Tesla, a man who, depending on who you asked at the time, was either an eccentric madman or a visionary genius, sometimes both. Nikola Tesla was born on a quiet night in 1856 in the village of Smiljan, which is now part of Croatia. The village itself was nothing remarkable, just a few houses, a church, cows grazing in the fields, and probably a lot of mosquitoes. But Tesla, even as a small child, seemed to carry the universe inside his head. While other kids were running around playing with sticks and mud, young Nikola was thinking about electricity, not in a vague, I like lightning way, but in a precise, obsessive, how can I harness this and make it dance to my will kind of way. Family accounts suggest that he could memorize entire books. He could visualize complex machines in perfect detail, turning the cogs and wheels in his mind before touching a single piece of metal. If someone told him this was normal, he probably would have laughed or maybe just furrowed his brow, which, for Tesla, apparently was permanent. His father was a priest, practical and cautious, which was not exactly the ideal environment for a child dreaming in lightning bolts and alternating currents. His mother, on the other hand, had a knack for inventing small household devices, and she encouraged young Nikola's curious mind. One could say the apple fell very far from the trunk, but in a rather electric way. Tesla's youth was not all visions of glowing coils and futuristic machines. He also suffered from peculiar phobias and obsessive habits. He reportedly had a fear of pearls, so strong that he refused to talk to women wearing them. One can only imagine the awkward dinner parties. He was also extremely particular about cleanliness, often spending hours washing his hands, which might explain how he survived in a time when germs were not yet a global concern. But it was not just quirks for the sake of being quirky. These habits seemed to coexist with his genius, forming a strange symphony of brilliance and oddity. When Tesla was old enough, he left home to study engineering. His mind was sharper than most textbooks, and yet, the world seemed unable to catch up with him. He studied in Graz, Austria, and later in Prague, while other students were memorizing equations to pass exams. Tesla was already imagining machines that could transmit energy without wires, rotate magnetic fields in a dance of invisible forces, and perhaps even communicate over great distances. Basically the blueprint for the 20th century. Before anyone knew what the 20th century was, professors were impressed in some cases and alarmed in others. Because why not make someone simultaneously brilliant and slightly terrifying? After finishing his studies, Tesla worked for a few electrical companies in Europe, including the famous Continental Edison Company in France. Here, he met Thomas Edison, the man already famous for making the world glow with electric light. Edison was practical, stubborn, and completely focused on direct current, or DC. Tesla, of course, preferred alternating current, AC. Imagine a polite conversation where one man insists the world should spin left, while the other insists it must spin right. That's basically how Tesla and Edison started their professional acquaintance, friendly on the surface, deadly in terms of electrical philosophy underneath. Eventually, Tesla made his way to America. In 1884, he arrived in New York with nothing but a letter of introduction to Edison, a few coins, and probably a sense that he was about to change the world, or at least annoy it thoroughly. The story goes that he worked for Edison for a short period, fixing machines and suggesting improvements. Edison apparently promised a huge bonus for a particular invention, but when Tesla asked for it, Edison said, "Tesla, you don't understand our American humor." So, naturally, Tesla quit. One can almost hear the quiet sigh of someone who had spent years trying to explain the beauty of invisible currents, only to be met with a shrug and a bad joke. From there, Tesla began his journey as a solo inventor, working in a tiny laboratory and sleeping in fits of obsessive inspiration. He created motors that ran on AC, illuminated cities with arc lamps, and even experimented with wireless lighting. People thought he was eccentric sometimes, because he would walk around the city feeding pigeons, sometimes because he claimed he could communicate with other planets. But Tesla did not care much for what people thought, because he was thinking in decades, maybe centuries ahead, while most of the world was still trying to invent the safe light bulb. Tesla's life was a series of brilliant ideas mixed with unfortunate social and financial choices. He invested in experiments that never produced profit. He turned down partnerships that would have secured him wealth. He was famously particular about the design and aesthetics of his inventions, sometimes at the expense of practicality. He even created a massive machine called the Tesla coil, which could produce spectacular displays of electricity, but also occasionally shocked visitors or terrified nearby animals. Tesla found this entertaining. The world found it alarming. Romantically, Tesla was minimal. He never married. He claimed his chastity allowed his mind to focus entirely on higher pursuits, which, if nothing else, makes him one of the earliest advocates of single-minded dedication in science. Some speculate he was too wrapped up in his visions to maintain ordinary human relationships. Others say he was just picky about pearls. The later years of Tesla's life were quieter, though hardly peaceful. He continued to work on concepts like wireless energy, transmission, and global communication. He published papers, gave lectures, and occasionally enjoyed the attention of curious journalists. Yet money was always tight, friends came and went, and investors often disappeared faster than the currents he loved. He lived in hotel rooms in New York, eating simple meals, feeding pigeons in the park, and jotting notes for ideas that seemed ridiculous to most of the world, but would later be recognized as miraculous. Tesla died in 1943 alone in a modest hotel room. Newspapers reported his death, and the world moved on. But over the decades, his reputation grew, as people realized just how far ahead of his time he had been. The modern world runs on principles he demonstrated: AC electricity, radio waves, remote control, wireless communication. Everything Tesla dreamed of, and often tried in vain, eventually came to life. So, tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine Tesla walking through the quiet streets of New York, a notebook in hand, imagining a world of lights, signals, and currents invisible to anyone else. A man called crazy by his contemporaries, misunderstood by peers, yet ultimately a genius whose ideas shaped the century. And in the quiet, in the hum of electricity that surrounds us today, you can almost hear him sigh, satisfied that the world finally caught up, albeit long after he had gone. Nikola Tesla's ambitions were, as usual, enormous. After making a name with his alternating current systems, he turned his attention to a project that many people at the time thought was pure fantasy. Tesla imagined a world where energy could be transmitted without wires. Not a little power. He wanted to light entire cities from the air, send signals across continents, and perhaps even harness the energy of the Earth itself. Most people laughed. Investors laughed. Even some scientists laughed. Tesla, of course, did not mind. In fact, he often considered laughter to be a sign of interest, or maybe a mild compliment. In 1901, Tesla began work on the Wardenclyffe Tower on Long Island. To outsiders, it looked like a giant metal obelisk rising from the ground, a strange combination of architecture and electrical engineering that somehow seemed like it belonged in a Jules Verne novel. Tesla intended it to be a wireless transmission station, capable of sending energy around the globe. He envisioned a future where homes, factories, and even ships could be powered without plugging anything in. Some investors were impressed, but most were skeptical, especially J.P. Morgan, who initially funded part of the project, but eventually pulled out, saying essentially, "Well, we like your imagination, but we prefer profits." Tesla's Wardenclyffe experiments were technically brilliant and aesthetically bizarre. He constructed massive coils, enormous capacitors, and towers topped with domes that looked like giant metallic mushrooms. Reports suggest that sometimes sparks would shoot from the tower into the sky, arcs of electricity dancing across the air like tiny lightning storms. Curious locals would watch in awe or panic, unsure whether they were witnessing genius or the apocalypse. Tesla, of course, was pleased either way. Despite the grandeur, the project never reached full completion. Financial troubles, logistical challenges, and waning investor confidence meant that Tesla could never fully realize his vision. Wardenclyffe Tower was eventually abandoned, dismantled, and sold for scrap, leaving behind the faintest hum of a dream that was far ahead of its time. But in Tesla's mind, this was not failure, it was research, or at the very least, practice for his next big idea. Tesla's life during this period was a careful balance between brilliance and eccentricity. He reportedly worked late into the night, sometimes sleeping only a few hours, often in the hotel rooms where he resided. He had peculiar routines. He would walk a precise number of blocks each day, dine only at certain times, and avoid contact with objects he considered unclean or ill-arranged. His obsession with pigeons continued. He fed them daily in New York parks and even took injured birds into his hotel room, nursing them with a dedication that some biographers describe as almost parental. One can picture a man surrounded by wires, coils, and the gentle cooing of birds, talking to them as though they understood the secrets of the universe. Romance, for Tesla, was almost entirely absent. He claimed that emotional entanglements distracted from higher pursuits. He never married and never had children. Some speculated that he simply preferred the company of ideas and pigeons to that of people. Others thought his mind was too delicate, too sensitive, or perhaps too finely tuned to the strange rhythms of electricity to settle into ordinary relationships. Whatever the reason, Tesla's love life, if one could call it that, existed in the form of curiosity, invention, and occasional admiration from journalists and socialites. Financially, Tesla struggled. Despite his genius, he was not a master of money. He often turned down lucrative deals, trusted the wrong people, or over-invested in projects that did not generate income. For example, he once claimed he had designed a death ray, though likely more speculative than practical, which might have made him rich, terrifying, and famous all at once. Yet no one funded this weapon, probably wisely, leaving Tesla to continue tinkering in relative obscurity. It was a combination of brilliance and tragic practicality. He could see the future, but he could not always navigate the present. In the 1920s and 30s, Tesla's public image became a mix of fascination and pity. He would give interviews describing futuristic ideas, wireless global communication, remote-controlled vehicles, harnessing cosmic energy. Newspapers occasionally featured him, often with the tone of bemused admiration. "The man who talks to pigeons," they might say, claims he can light the world from the air. And indeed, he could, at least in theory. But society was not ready for such visions. Edison's practical DC systems, Marconi's early radio experiments, and the general skepticism of financiers meant that Tesla's genius continued to float, slightly ahead of the mainstream, admired but not fully embraced. By the late 1930s, Tesla's world had shrunk. He lived quietly in hotel rooms, accompanied by his pigeons, continuing to scribble equations and designs on scraps of paper. Friends were scarce, money was scarce, and yet, the intensity of his mind never waned. Visitors recalled him as polite, soft-spoken, and always absorbed in thought. Sometimes, he would pause mid-conversation to watch the motion of a beam of sunlight, as if it were a physical manifestation of electricity itself. One imagines that the rest of the world was clunky, slow, and dim in comparison to Tesla's inner vision, a place where arcs of energy danced freely, unrestrained by walls or wires. Tesla passed away in 1943, in room 3327 of the New Yorker Hotel. Quietly, as one might drift off into a dream, he was found by hotel staff, a man alone but unbroken, surrounded by notebooks, papers, and probably pigeons who had long since flown away. At the time, his death received only modest attention in the press. Few realized that this quiet, odd, obsessive man had envisioned so much of the modern world. Wireless communication, electric grids, even concepts that would become radar and remote control. Today, the name Nikola Tesla is synonymous with genius, with vision, with the kind of mind that thinks in decades or centuries rather than hours. People speak of him with reverence, awe, and sometimes a wistful sense of what might have been if the world had been a little faster, a little braver, a little more willing to trust the weird, pigeon-feeding inventor in a New York hotel. And in a sense, that is Tesla's legacy. Not merely the machines he built, but the dreams he dared to dream, the strange, quiet persistence of a man who refused to be ordinary. So, as we let our thoughts drift tonight, consider the life of Nikola Tesla, a life lived slightly ahead of time, with moments of brilliance, solitude, and gentle oddity. He reminds us that genius often walks alone, that vision may be misunderstood, and that sometimes the world catches up long after the dreamer has gone to bed. Part 2. Nikola Tesla, the man who tried to wire the world and lost track of time. Now that we've eased into the story of Nikola Tesla, let's float a little further along his peculiar, electric path. After the Wardenclyffe Tower project began to collapse under financial and practical pressure, Tesla didn't exactly slow down. Oh no, if anything, he accelerated into even stranger realms of invention, speculation, and public fascination. In the 1910s and 22nd, Tesla became something of a public curiosity. Newspapers often featured him as the man who walks alone, thinks alone, and possibly communicates with the cosmos. Some journalists adored him, others quietly suspected he had a screw loose. Tesla didn't mind either way. To him, reality was less important than ideas, and time itself seemed negotiable. He would sometimes work through the night and into the early hours, resting only a few hours before starting again. Sleep was a tool, not a necessity, a sentiment that might resonate with over-caffeinated inventors and late-night thinkers even today. Tesla's experiments during this period were ambitious, to say the least. He spoke of transmitting electricity without wires across continents, lighting the streets of New York and Paris from a single tower. He claimed he could communicate with other planets. He hinted, subtly, at inventions that could serve as defensive weapons. It's hard to know which of these were real projects, which were exaggerations to attract attention, and which were merely mental exercises. Sometimes, even Tesla seemed to blur the lines himself. Financially, Tesla was always precarious. Investors would come and go like clouds, sometimes leaving behind enough funds for a modest experiment, sometimes leaving nothing but the faint smell of disappointment. He had a habit of promising results before he had results. Some might call that optimism, others might call it charmingly naive. And yet, despite the lack of consistent funding, Tesla continued to create, tinker, and test. He had the peculiar ability to turn almost any scrap of material into a device or demonstration. A coil here, spark there, and suddenly you had something that could light a lamp, spin a motor, or make a small animal jump in mild surprise. Tesla's eccentricities, of course, became more pronounced. He was obsessed with the number 3, often walking around a block 3 times before entering a building. He disliked jewelry, especially pearls, as previously mentioned, and sometimes refused to shake hands with certain people based on their attire or mannerisms. He also had a very particular diet, reportedly favoring milk, bread, and honey, occasionally punctuated with something more exotic if his inspiration demanded it. All of this contributed to a sense of him as both brilliant and slightly otherworldly. Imagine someone who could see the entire structure of an electrical system in his mind while simultaneously calculating the perfect number of steps to avoid bad luck, a combination both fascinating and confusing to the average person. One particularly memorable experiment during this time involved what Tesla described as teleautomatics. Essentially, he created remote-controlled boats that could move without human touch. In the early 1890s, these were shown at exhibitions, causing mild panic among onlookers. Some people screamed when the boats moved on their own, thinking they were haunted or guided by spirits. Tesla calmly demonstrated, again and again, that it was just science. Of course, it was science. Nothing to see here, except, maybe, the future of robotics, drones, and remote technology. Despite his public demonstrations, Tesla's personal life was quietly lonely. He spent his evenings feeding pigeons, walking the streets of Manhattan, and jotting down ideas that often seemed like science fiction. Some pigeons, particularly one white pigeon he favored above all others, were treated with almost human-like affection. Tesla once reportedly said that this bird was the joy of his life, and if it were necessary, he would have done anything for it. Whether he meant this literally or metaphorically, one can imagine the scene. A man alone with his notebooks, feeding a single bird under the dim streetlights, whispering about electricity, energy, and the cosmos. Cultural mythology around Tesla also began to grow during this time. He became the subject of stories, ranging from the plausible to the outright fantastical. Some claimed he had discovered free energy that would power the entire planet. Others insisted he could control weather or even predict the future. Tesla did little to quash these rumors. He had bigger things on his mind than public perception. And yet, through all this, he remained modest about his achievements, often deflecting praise to his inventions themselves rather than taking personal credit. As the years progressed, Tesla's world became increasingly solitary. His experiments continued, though often on a smaller, more personal scale. He maintained friendships with a few scientists and journalists, entertained occasional visits from wealthy patrons, and kept a meticulous routine. Yet there was a melancholy that accompanied his genius. He had seen the world begin to catch up to his ideas, but never fully embraced them in his lifetime. Wireless energy, radio, and modern electrical systems all reflected his influence, but Tesla himself struggled with recognition, funding, and health. Tesla died quietly in 1943, leaving behind a legacy that would grow far larger after his passing. His notebooks, sketches, and inventions became treasures for historians, scientists, and inventors. Modern technology, the kind we use without thinking, day after day owes much to Tesla's vision. Without his alternating current, wireless communication experiments, and inventive mind, the 20th century might have looked very different indeed. In reflection, Tesla's life is a reminder of the strange and delicate balance between genius and eccentricity, between vision and practicality, between solitude and societal recognition. He lived ahead of his time, obsessed with ideas that seemed impossible, yet quietly shaping the world for generations to come. And tonight, as you rest, you might picture him walking along empty city streets, a notebook in hand, quietly dreaming of a world that could glow, hum, and communicate, all powered by invisible currents and the persistence of a single, extraordinary mind. Part 3. Nikola Tesla dreams that outlasted the man. By the time Tesla reached the final decades of his life, the world had begun to catch glimpses of the extraordinary ideas he had spent decades nurturing. Yet, As often happens with visionaries, the recognition came slowly, sporadically, and sometimes posthumously. While the average person flicked on a light switch or listened to the radio, few realized that a quiet, eccentric man in New York had imagined these technologies decades earlier. Tesla's influence on modern science cannot be overstated, though it is subtle in its presence. Alternating current, which he championed against Edison's direct current, became the standard for electricity grids worldwide. Without his insistence on AC systems, cities might never have been able to expand the way they did, and the convenient electrical infrastructure we take for granted could have been delayed by decades. His patents and theoretical work on motors, transformers, and power distribution laid the groundwork for a century of electrical engineering. And yet, Tesla himself did not always profit from this success. He often sold patents for modest sums or allowed others to capitalize on his ideas, trusting that progress was reward enough. Tesla also imagined technologies that were far ahead of their time. Concepts resembling radar, radio, remote control, and wireless energy transmission all passed through his mind long before the broader scientific community could grasp them. He spoke openly of a world connected by invisible signals, of machines communicating without wires, and even hinted at principles that later scientists would explore in particle physics and quantum mechanics. While some of these ideas were never fully realized, the echoes of Tesla's imagination can still be traced through the development of modern devices. It was not just his technical mind that fascinated people, it was his unusual perspective on the world. Tesla had a way of blending practical engineering with philosophical musings. He often described energy, matter, and the universe in poetic terms, almost as if he were conversing with nature itself. While others were content to measure voltage and current, Tesla wondered about the very essence of energy, where it came from, how it moved, and whether it could be tapped directly from the Earth or the cosmos. Such ideas were labeled eccentric at the time, but today they hint at the depth of his curiosity and the expansive nature of his vision. Tesla's eccentricities, of course, persisted until the end. He reportedly worked in increments of 3 repeated steps, and adhered to routines that seemed almost ritualistic. He dined alone, often at precise times, and had peculiar preferences for foods and hotel arrangements. The world may have considered him crazy, but Tesla likely considered the world slow, messy, and occasionally illogical. Pigeons remained a constant in his life. He fed them daily, sometimes nursing injured birds back to health with the same care and precision he devoted to electrical experiments. There is a quiet poignancy in imagining a man who could visualize global power grids, yet found his most loyal companionship in birds. Even after his death, Tesla's story grew in mythic proportion. Authors, inventors, and enthusiasts began to explore the what-ifs of Tesla's life. What if he had received proper funding for Wardenclyffe Tower? What if his ideas for wireless energy had been fully realized? Could the world have been powered differently? These questions became almost a genre of their own, reflecting both the gaps in Tesla's recognition during his life and the his ideas inspired in hindsight. Conspiracies and exaggerations naturally followed, because a man who once claimed he could send signals to Mars and create a death ray is an irresistible figure for speculation. Some claimed he had hidden inventions that could change the world, while others suggested his papers were confiscated by government agencies immediately after his death. While much of this is likely fanciful, it does underline the continuing fascination with Tesla, a man so far ahead of his era that fact, rumor, and imagination blur together. Yet, despite the myths, the core of Tesla's life remains remarkably simple when stripped down. A man obsessed with the invisible, a man who imagined a connected world before it existed, and a man who pursued ideas relentlessly, often at the expense of wealth, comfort, or conventional happiness. He was a dreamer, a scientist, a recluse, A visionary and sometimes, yes, a little odd. But genius often wears such eccentricities like a badge. Tesla reminds us that innovation is not always celebrated in the moment, that ideas may be ignored, laughed at, or misunderstood, that solitude and obsession can coexist with brilliance, and that sometimes the world only catches up long after the dreamer has departed. So tonight, as you let your eyes grow heavy and thoughts drift towards sleep, picture Nikola Tesla in a quiet hotel room, surrounded by notebooks, coils, and the faint hum of electricity. Imagine him whispering to pigeons, scribbling ideas for wireless energy, and envisioning a world that would one day glow, hum, and connect in ways even he might have struggled to fully comprehend. A man called crazy in his own time, who lived, worked, and ultimately died a genius, a quiet, patient genius whose mind illuminated the future long before the rest of us noticed. And with that thought, let yourself sink into the gentle current of history, the slow hum of invention, and the quiet, unwavering brilliance of Nikola Tesla. Let the ideas float past you, like invisible sparks, soft and gentle, until sleep carries you into your own dreams of possibility. Part 4. Nikola Tesla, the quiet genius who danced with lightning. As we drift toward the conclusion of Nikola Tesla's story tonight, it's worth pausing to consider the man behind the inventions, the myths, and the eccentricities. Tesla was, in every sense, a paradox. He was extraordinarily focused, yet wildly imaginative. He was both lonely and constantly in motion, thinking, observing, and creating. He was considered crazy by many, and yet, in retrospect, he was the quiet architect of a world that runs almost entirely on his ideas. In his later years, Tesla's life became increasingly solitary, and some might view it as sad. He lived in small hotel rooms, fed pigeons, and spoke to them as though they were colleagues in his work. To a modern observer, this might seem peculiar, perhaps even eccentric, but perhaps it was also necessary. Tesla's mind required space to wander, to calculate, to envision things no one else could see. He needed silence to hear the faint hum of electricity and the delicate rhythm of his thoughts. His routines were peculiar, yet precise. He would walk a certain number of blocks, touch objects a specific number of times, and dine at exact hours. These habits might seem obsessive, but they also reveal a man seeking order in a world that often seemed chaotic, a world that did not always understand him. Tesla lived in a rhythm of his own making, a cadence that matched the electric pulse he saw in everything. Tesla never married, never had children, and did not seek fame in the conventional sense. Recognition, wealth, or accolades mattered little to him compared to the pursuit of knowledge, the thrill of invention, and the quiet satisfaction of understanding the invisible forces of the universe. Yet, despite his isolation, Tesla remained polite, charming in his peculiar way, and endlessly curious about the world around him. He was a man who could look at a beam of sunlight, a spark of electricity, or a flock of pigeons, and see entire systems, possibilities, and ideas unfold. The Wardenclyffe Tower, the remote-controlled boats, the alternating current systems, the visions of wireless energy, all of these were parts of a lifetime spent dancing with the invisible. Many of his projects failed, many of his predictions were not immediately realized, and many people did not understand him. And yet, in the long view of history, these are the things that define Tesla: a restless, brilliant mind that refused to be contained, a visionary whose ideas would ripple through generations. Today, Tesla's name is celebrated. He is remembered in museums, textbooks, and even in popular culture. The car that bears his name, the units of magnetic flux named in his honor, the countless devices we take for granted, all are threads of the world he imagined, often decades before anyone else could see it. And yet, there is something quietly poetic in remembering that Tesla himself never fully experienced this recognition. He lived for ideas, not applause, and perhaps that is part of his enduring charm. As we close this chapter tonight, imagine Nikola Tesla walking alone through the quiet streets of Manhattan, a notebook in hand, mind alive with sparks of imagination. Imagine him pausing to feed a pigeon, watching a spark jump between two wires, and quietly marveling at the beauty of energy itself. Picture a man who lived slightly ahead of his time, who dreamed in currents, and who left behind a world illuminated, in ways both literal and figurative, by his brilliance. Tesla's life reminds us that genius is not always flashy, not always immediately rewarded, and often misunderstood. It is patient, persistent, and sometimes quietly lonely, but it leaves traces, sparks that outlive the person, whispers of possibility in every flicker of light, every radio signal, and every invention that draws on electricity. So, as your eyes grow heavy tonight, let Tesla's story linger softly in your mind. Think of his visions, his routines, his gentle obsession with pigeons, and the quiet courage of a man who pursued impossible ideas. And let yourself drift, like electricity through the air, carried by the gentle hum of history, into your own dreams. Nikola Tesla, a man called crazy, a man called genius, a man who danced with lightning and left the world a little brighter than he found it. Good night, everyone.